Right now, as you read these words, you are using a brain that is identical to one that existed 200,000 years ago. Same size, same structure, same potential. But here is what makes this fact absolutely mind-bending. A human from 200,000 years ago would look at your world and understand almost nothing. Not because their brain was different, but because something extraordinary happened around 50,000 years ago that changed everything. This is not a story about biological evolution. This is a story about the moment humanity truly woke up. Picture two humans standing side by side. One lived 150,000 years ago, the other 40,000 years ago. Physically, you could not tell them apart. Same skull shape, same body proportions, same brain capacity averaging around 1,400 cubic centimeters. If you dressed them both in modern clothes and placed them on a subway, most people would not notice anything unusual. They were anatomically identical to you and me. But if you looked at their lives, at what they created and how they lived, you would see two completely different worlds. The first human lived in a world their ancestors from 500,000 years earlier would recognize instantly. Simple stone tools that had not changed in hundreds of thousands of years. No art, no jewelry, no symbols carved into rock or bone. Just survival, day after day, generation after generation, doing the same things their parents did and their grandparents before them. The second human lived in an explosion of creativity that would have seemed like magic to their earlier counterpart. They painted stunning images on cave walls, animals so beautifully rendered you could almost see them breathing. They carved figurines from ivory and stone. They made jewelry from shells collected hundreds of miles away. They built sophisticated weapons that let them hunt from distances their ancestors could never imagine. They buried their dead with elaborate rituals, placing tools and ornaments in graves as if preparing them for another journey. They created music, crafting flutes from hollow bones with carefully positioned holes tuned to specific pitches. They were building boats and crossing oceans to reach lands no human had ever seen. They were thinking symbolically, abstractly, creatively, in ways that define what we call modern human behavior today. So, what happened between these two moments in time? What changed around 50,000 years ago that transformed anatomically modern humans who had been doing essentially nothing remarkable for 150,000 years into the innovative, creative, world-conquering species we recognize as truly modern? This is the central mystery of human evolution, and scientists have been arguing about it for decades. Some call it the cognitive revolution. Others call it the Great Leap Forward or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Whatever name you give it, this was the moment when humans stopped being just another clever primate and became something unprecedented in Earth's history. And the strangest part is this: we still do not fully understand why it happened. Was it a genetic mutation that suddenly rewired our brains, giving us the capacity for complex language or symbolic thought? Was it a cultural innovation that spread like wildfire through human populations, teaching them new ways to think and communicate? Was it simply a matter of population size, reaching a critical threshold where innovations could finally spread faster than they were lost? Or was it something else entirely? Something we have not even considered yet? The truth is probably more complex than any single explanation. But to understand what happened 50,000 years ago, we need to start at the very beginning. We need to trace the full journey of Homo sapiens from our origins in Africa to that explosive moment when everything changed. This is a story about transformation, about a species that spent most of its existence doing almost nothing remarkable, then suddenly became remarkable at everything. If you are watching this to fall asleep, perfect. That is exactly why I make these videos. Subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at lunch, London at midnight, Saigon at dinner, all experiencing this story together. Now let us go back to the beginning, back to Africa 200,000 years ago, when the first anatomically modern humans were taking their first breaths with absolutely no idea that their distant descendants would one day walk on the moon. Let us understand why these people, despite having brains as large and capable as ours, lived in ways we would barely recognize as human today. Around 200,000 years ago, somewhere in East Africa, something remarkable was happening. A new kind of human was emerging, one that would eventually become us. They were not appearing out of nowhere. Evolution does not work that way. They were emerging gradually from earlier hominin populations, probably Homo heidelbergensis, through thousands of generations of incremental change. But at some point, the changes accumulated enough that we can point to fossil skulls and say that is one of us. That is Homo sapiens. The evidence comes from sites scattered across Africa. At Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, archaeologists found skulls dated to around 233,000 years ago, fragmentary but clearly modern in their basic structure. At Herto, also in Ethiopia, they discovered skulls from about 160,000 years ago, showing fully modern anatomy. And remarkably, at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, fossils dated to around 315,000 years ago show a mix of archaic and modern features, suggesting the transition to modern humans might have begun even earlier than anyone thought. But here is what puzzles archaeologists. Despite having modern brains and modern bodies, these early humans were not doing particularly modern things, and understanding why requires understanding the world they lived in. Africa 200,000 years ago was nothing like the Africa you see in nature documentaries. This was Ice Age Africa, going through wild climate swings that would test human survival to its absolute limits. While massive ice sheets covered Europe and North America, Africa experienced periods of intense aridity, punctuated by brief wet phases. Lakes filled and emptied over thousands of years. Forests expanded and contracted. Grasslands turned to desert and back again. The human populations trying to survive in this environment were small. Not just small, but desperately fragmented. Scattered across vast territories in tiny groups that might go years without encountering other humans outside their immediate band. We are talking about populations in the low thousands, maybe tens of thousands at most, spread across an entire continent. These were not cities or even villages. These were extended family bands of 20 to 40 individuals camping near water sources, following animal herds, gathering whatever plant foods they could find. Life was a constant struggle against climate, predators, disease, and hunger. The fossil evidence for these earliest modern humans is maddeningly sparse, which itself tells us something about how few of them there were and how precarious their existence must have been. But what little evidence we have reveals something fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. These people were certainly more sophisticated than their ancestors. They were making carefully shaped stone points, probably for spears. They were creating scrapers and cutting tools with specific functions. They understood heat treatment, learning that you could improve the quality of certain stones by heating them in fires before working them. This was genuine technological innovation. They were not just picking up rocks and bashing them together. They were planning ahead, understanding material properties, teaching these skills to their children across generations. But here is the puzzling part. This technology does not change much over time. Look at stone tools from 250,000 years ago, then look at tools from 200,000 years ago, then 150,000 years ago. They are remarkably similar. Same basic designs, same manufacturing techniques, same functions. There is innovation, but it is incredibly slow, happening at a glacial pace that seems bizarre for people with fully modern cognitive abilities. If these people had brains just like ours, capable of everything we can do today, why were they not innovating faster? Why were they not creating art, making jewelry, developing new technologies every generation the way humans would do after 50,000 years ago? The answer probably lies in those population numbers and the brutal reality of their environment. When you have a population of only a few thousand people spread across millions of square kilometers, innovation becomes incredibly difficult to sustain. Sure, maybe one genius in one group figures out a better way to make spear points, or process plant foods. That person teaches their children, and the innovation spreads through their small band. But if that knowledge does not spread to other groups separated by hundreds of miles of hostile territory, it remains localized and fragile. One drought that wipes out that particular group, one disease outbreak, one hunting accident that kills the key knowledge holder, and that innovation is gone forever, lost to time as if it never existed. This is the cruel mathematics of small populations. Innovation requires not just intelligence, but also numbers and connectivity. You need enough people that someone occasionally has a brilliant idea. You need enough social connections that the idea can spread from group to group before it dies out. You need enough stability that knowledge can be preserved and built upon across multiple generations. Early Homo sapiens had the intelligence, absolutely. Their brains were as large and complex as ours. But they did not have the numbers or the connectivity. They were trapped in what anthropologists call a low-density equilibrium, smart enough to innovate, but too scattered and too few to build on those innovations systematically. The environment they lived in made everything harder. Africa during this period was characterized by what climate scientists call high variance. Not just that conditions were harsh, but that they kept changing unpredictably. A valley that provided abundant resources for one generation might become uninhabitable desert in the next. Water sources that had been reliable for decades could dry up in a single catastrophic year. Animal populations would boom during good times and crash during bad, creating feast and famine cycles that kept human populations perpetually on edge. Under these conditions, survival required not specialization, but flexibility. You could not afford to become too dependent on any single resource or any single strategy, because that resource might disappear next year or next decade. You needed to maintain a broad toolkit capable of exploiting whatever opportunities presented themselves when and where they appeared. This selected for intelligence and adaptability, which our ancestors clearly had. But it worked against the kind of cumulative cultural evolution that drives rapid technological change. Think about it from the perspective of a small band trying to survive. You have maybe 30 people, a few children who need constant care and protection, a few elderly individuals who can no longer hunt effectively, but who carry crucial knowledge about past climate cycles and distant resources. And you have a group of adults who need to spend most of their time finding food, processing it, dealing with the constant challenges of survival in a harsh and unpredictable environment. How much time and energy can you devote to experimentation? How much can you afford to risk on unproven innovations? If you are barely surviving with known techniques, adopting an unproven new method could mean death for your entire group. So you stick with what works. You teach your children the same skills your parents taught you. You maintain the traditions that have kept your lineage alive for thousands of generations. This conservative approach to survival makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. The groups that survived were the ones that did not take unnecessary risks. Natural selection favored caution, tradition, and the preservation of proven knowledge over experimentation and innovation. Innovation happened, but slowly, cautiously, only when circumstances really demanded it. The archaeological record from this period reflects this reality perfectly. We see the same basic Middle Stone Age technology across vast regions of Africa with only minor regional variations. Different groups developed slightly different styles and techniques, adapted to their local environments, but there is no exponential acceleration of innovation, no sudden explosion of new technologies or new behaviors. What we also do not see is much evidence of symbolic behavior. There is no art, no jewelry, no burial practices with grave goods, no clear evidence that these people were creating symbols or engaging in the kind of abstract reasoning that characterizes modern human behavior. They probably had language, almost certainly in fact, because you cannot maintain the kind of social coordination and knowledge transfer they needed without sophisticated communication. But they were not leaving us messages. They were not making marks on cave walls or carving figurines or creating ornaments to express identity or status. Does this mean they could not? That their brains were somehow not quite capable of symbolic thinking, despite being anatomically modern? Probably not. More likely, they could, but they did not need to. Or perhaps more accurately, they did not have the population size, the social complexity, and the environmental stability that would make symbolic behavior advantageous enough to invest the time and resources in developing it. You have to remember, creating art or jewelry or elaborate burial rituals requires surplus. Surplus time, surplus energy, surplus resources beyond what you need for immediate survival. It requires a level of security where you can afford to expend effort on things that do not immediately contribute to finding food, avoiding predators, or protecting your children. These early humans were not there yet. They were still in pure survival mode, still living generation to generation, still hoping the rains would come and the herds would return and that they could make it through another year. But they were surviving. Despite everything working against them, the small populations, the harsh environments, the limited technology, they were hanging on. And in surviving, they were accumulating something precious that archaeologists can never find in the ground. They were accumulating knowledge. Knowledge about their environment, about animal behavior, about which plants were edible and which were poisonous, about weather patterns and seasonal changes. Knowledge encoded in stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, embedded in traditions and techniques that might seem simple, but represented generations of trial and error and hard-won wisdom. They were also accumulating something else, something invisible but equally precious. Genetic adaptations. Natural selection was constantly at work during these harsh millennia, favoring individuals who were just a bit smarter, a bit more socially skilled, a bit better at learning and teaching, a bit more capable of cooperation and planning. These advantages were tiny, perhaps improving survival chances by only a few percentage points. But over thousands of generations, over tens of thousands of years, those tiny advantages accumulated into something substantial. The genes that helped people communicate better, remember more details, solve problems more creatively, those genes became more common with each passing generation. Evolution was quietly preparing humanity for something extraordinary, even if no one could have predicted what was coming. By 100,000 years ago, humans had reached a kind of threshold. They were physically modern, cognitively capable, but culturally still relatively simple. They were like a rocket sitting on a launch pad, fully fueled and ready, but not yet ignited. And then, slowly at first, things began to change. Archaeological sites from around this time start showing hints of something different, tiny glimmers that suggested the long stagnation might finally be ending. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to around 100,000 years ago, people were collecting ochre, that red iron oxide pigment humans had used for millennia. But now they were doing something new with it. They were grinding it into powder, mixing it with fat or bone marrow, creating a paint-like substance. And most remarkably, they were carving patterns into pieces of ochre, geometric designs, crosshatches, and parallel lines that served no obvious practical purpose. These engravings are profound because they represent abstract thinking, the ability to create symbols that stand for ideas or concepts beyond immediate physical reality. This is the foundation of everything that makes human culture possible, from writing to mathematics to religion. But here is what makes this discovery both exciting and frustrating. These ochre engravings appear, persist for a few thousand years at this one site, and then disappear from the archaeological record. Later groups in the same region do not seem to use ochre the same way. The innovation does not spread widely. It does not transform human behavior across Africa. It is like someone invented writing, used it for a generation, and then everyone forgot about it. This pattern of flickering innovation appears repeatedly during this period. Shell beads show up at a few sites, carefully selected from specific species, deliberately perforated and strung together to make jewelry or decorative items. These are not random shells picked up from nearby beaches. They are specific species, often collected from locations dozens of miles away from where they were eventually found and used. Someone was traveling specifically to get these shells. Someone valued them enough to carry them back across difficult terrain. Someone cared about how they looked, about self-decoration and personal expression. But again, this behavior does not spread everywhere. It appears in some places, disappears, reappears later somewhere else. The innovations are real, the cognitive capabilities are clearly there, but something is preventing these behaviors from taking hold permanently and spreading widely. Population size is still the likely culprit. With human numbers still relatively low and groups still relatively isolated, even good innovations struggled to gain traction across broader populations before disappearing. Then, around 74,000 years ago, disaster struck on a scale that nearly ended the human story forever. Mount Toba in what is now Indonesia underwent one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years of Earth history. This was not just a big eruption, this was a super eruption that ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba was nearly 3,000 times larger. The ash from this eruption spread across the entire planet. In India today, there are places where Toba ash lies in layers several meters thick. Even in Africa, thousands of miles away from the eruption, a thin layer of volcanic ash marks the moment when the sky turned dark and stayed dark for months or even years. The environmental impact was catastrophic beyond anything humans had experienced before. Ash particles suspended in the upper atmosphere blocked sunlight across much of the world. Global temperatures may have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, particularly those closer to the eruption, the cooling could have been even more severe, perhaps 10 degrees or more for several years. This volcanic winter could have lasted for years, possibly even decades, fundamentally disrupting ecosystems across multiple continents. When sunlight is blocked, photosynthesis slows down dramatically. Plants struggle to grow or die entirely. Herbivores that depend on those plants starve. Carnivores that hunt those herbivores starve. Entire food chains collapse from the bottom up, and humans who depended on hunting and gathering in already marginal environments would have been hit incredibly hard by this cascading ecological disaster. Genetic evidence suggests another severe population bottleneck around this time, though scientists debate exactly how severe it was. Some estimates suggest the effective breeding population of humans may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals worldwide, possibly even fewer. Think about what that means in practical terms. All those networks your ancestors had been building over tens of thousands of years, those trade routes connecting groups across hundreds of miles, those relationships between distant bands, many of them would have simply disappeared as populations crashed. Groups that had been flourishing in productive territories suddenly found themselves starving as local climates shifted and resources vanished. Regions that had been marginal but survivable became completely uninhabitable, forcing people to flee or die. Entire populations may have been wiped out, their accumulated knowledge and innovations lost forever, with no one left to pass them on. Some researchers think the Toba eruption nearly caused human extinction, that for a few thousand years our species teetered on the edge of disappearing entirely from Earth. Others argue the impact was less severe, that human populations were resilient enough to weather even this catastrophe without coming quite as close to the brink as the most dramatic scenarios suggest. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Toba was devastating, absolutely catastrophic for human populations across Africa and Asia. Many people died, entire regional populations probably disappeared completely, and the survivors faced conditions harsher than anything their ancestors had experienced. But they did survive. And genetic analysis shows something remarkable about the populations that made it through this bottleneck. They were not just random survivors who happened to get lucky, they carried specific genetic variants that seemed to be strongly favored during this crisis period. Variants related to cognitive function, to immune system response, to metabolic efficiency that allowed them to survive on fewer calories during the terrible years of cold and hunger. Toba was another selection event, another evolutionary filter, another moment when only the smartest, most adaptable, most cooperative humans made it through to reproduce and pass on their genes. Natural selection was continuing to refine humanity, forging our species in repeated catastrophes, each disaster selecting for exactly the traits that would eventually allow us to dominate the entire planet. But your ancestors were not just sitting in Africa, passively waiting for conditions to improve. Even before Toba, some groups had been exploring beyond the continent. Around 120,000 years ago, during a wet climate phase, when the Sahara Desert was more crossable, some human groups left Africa and moved into the Middle East, establishing themselves in the Levant region that connects Africa to Asia. We know this happened because archaeologists have found anatomically modern human fossils at sites like Skul and Kafse in Israel, dated to around 120,000 to 90,000 years ago. These people made it out of Africa, established themselves in new territories, and lived there for thousands of years. But then they disappeared from the fossil record. We do not know exactly what happened to them. Maybe they were outcompeted by Neanderthals, who had been living in the region much longer and were better adapted to local conditions. Maybe climate change made their territories uninhabitable, and they died out or retreated back to Africa. Maybe they just went extinct the way small, isolated populations sometimes do through bad luck, inbreeding, or random demographic fluctuations. Whatever happened, these early pioneers left no genetic legacy. The humans living outside Africa today do not trace their ancestry to this first attempted migration. This tells us something crucial about the long period between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago. Our ancestors had the physical ability to leave Africa and colonize new territories. They had the intelligence, the adaptability, and at least some level of technology. But they lacked something else, some combination of cultural knowledge, social organization, technological capability, and perhaps population size that would let them not just survive in new environments, but thrive there, outcompete other human species, and establish permanent populations that could grow and spread. Meanwhile, Neanderthals were doing extremely well in Europe and Western Asia. They had been there for over 200,000 years by this point, perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. They were not primitive brutes as they were once portrayed. They were master hunters with sophisticated group tactics, taking down woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceros with carefully coordinated hunts. They made complex tools requiring multiple manufacturing steps and careful planning, including hafted spears with stone points attached to wooden shafts using natural adhesives. They controlled fire, made clothing from animal hides, possibly even constructed primitive shelters. They had larger brains on average than modern humans, though brain size alone does not determine intelligence. In every meaningful way, Neanderthals during this period were just as advanced as modern humans, possibly more so in some aspects of cold weather survival and hunting large game. The Denisovans, that other archaic human species known mainly from genetic evidence, and a handful of fossils, were equally successful in Asia. Genetic studies show they had spread from Siberia in the north all the way to Southeast Asia in the south, adapting to everything from Arctic tundra to tropical forests. They were survivors just like Homo Sapiens, just like Neanderthals, equally intelligent and equally capable. So why were modern humans not special yet? Why had we not begun our march to world domination? The answer comes back to those same limiting factors we discussed earlier. Population size was still relatively small, groups were still relatively isolated, innovation was still slow and easily lost. The cultural knowledge that would later give modern humans decisive advantages over other human species had not yet accumulated to critical levels. But that was about to change, because around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, something began to shift. We cannot point to a single moment or a single cause, and that is probably because there was not a single moment or single cause. What happened was more like a cascade of changes, each one reinforcing the others, gradually accelerating until they reached a tipping point where everything exploded. Population numbers started to increase as climate conditions improved in some regions. This meant more people, which meant more potential for innovation, simply because you had more minds working on problems. It also meant groups were closer together geographically, which increased interaction and allowed innovations to spread more easily between bands. Trade networks began to develop more systematically, with evidence of raw materials moving hundreds of miles from their sources. Obsidian from volcanic regions shows up far from any volcano. High-quality stone for tool making appears in places where it does not occur naturally. Shells from specific coastlines are found far inland. This trade was not just about getting useful materials. It was creating social connections, relationships between groups, networks through which not just goods could flow, but ideas, technologies, stories, and genes. These networks were becoming the highways of human culture. Tool technology was evolving rapidly now, faster than it had in the previous 150,000 years. The simple Middle Stone Age toolkit was being supplemented with more sophisticated implements. Composite tools made from multiple parts became common, requiring not just skill to manufacture, but the ability to conceptualize a finished product made from components that had to be gathered separately and assembled. Hafting technology improved dramatically, with people developing better adhesives and more secure methods for attaching stone points to wooden shafts. Specialized tools began appearing, different implements designed for specific tasks rather than general-purpose tools used for everything. Microliths, tiny stone blades that could be mounted in series along a shaft to create a cutting edge sharper than any single large blade, started showing up in the archaeological record. This diversification of the toolkit suggests something important about human cognition during this period. People were thinking more abstractly about how to solve problems. They were not just using whatever tool was at hand for whatever job needed doing. They were designing specific tools for specific purposes, which requires the ability to think ahead, to imagine future tasks and plan solutions before the need arises. They were also becoming more efficient in their use of raw materials. Earlier humans would make a hand axe from a single piece of stone, creating one tool and discarding a lot of waste material. Now people were learning to prepare cores carefully and strike off dozens of long, thin blades from a single piece of stone, getting far more cutting edge per kilogram of raw material. This efficiency mattered because it meant a group could carry lighter loads while traveling, but still have all the tools they needed. And there was something else happening, something perhaps even more significant than the technological changes. People were starting to think symbolically in ways that left unmistakable traces in the archaeological record. We see this in the sudden appearance of personal ornaments and decorative items. Shell beads become common at sites across Africa and the Middle East between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. These are not occasional finds anymore, but systematic evidence that people were regularly creating and wearing jewelry. Cave paintings begin appearing, first in Africa and Southeast Asia, then spreading to Europe. The earliest known figurative art, meaning art that depicts recognizable objects like animals or humans rather than abstract patterns, dates to around 45,000 to 40,000 years ago. At sites in Germany, archaeologists have found exquisitely carved figurines of animals and humans made from mammoth ivory, requiring incredible skill and patience. At Chauvet Cave in France, painted around 37,000 years ago, the walls are covered with over 400 animal figures rendered with stunning realism. These artists were not just drawing stick figures. They understood perspective, movement, anatomy, shading created by varying the thickness of pigment. They were capturing not just what animals looked like, but how they moved, their essence and character. This is sophisticated artistic expression requiring advanced cognitive abilities, the same mental toolkit that allows humans to create all forms of art today. But art was just one manifestation of this symbolic revolution. Burial practices were becoming elaborate and systematic. Earlier humans had occasionally buried their dead, but now it was becoming ritualized. Bodies were carefully positioned, often in specific orientations. They were buried with grave goods, tools, and ornaments they might need in an afterlife, suggesting belief in continued existence after death. Some burials show evidence of being reopened and revisited, implying ongoing relationships with the deceased. At Sunghir in Russia, archaeologists found children buried in clothing decorated with thousands of ivory beads. The time required to make those beads would have been enormous, months or even years of labor, suggesting massive communal investment in honoring the dead. This is not just disposal of bodies. This is evidence of complex beliefs about death, possibly about an afterlife, certainly about the significance of individual human beings as entities worthy of being remembered and honored. Music also makes its appearance in the archaeological record during this period. Bone flutes with carefully positioned holes have been found at sites in Europe dating to around 40,000 years ago. These are not simple whistles, but genuine musical instruments capable of playing melodies. Your ancestors were making music, creating beauty through sound, expressing something that went beyond mere survival. They were becoming fully human in ways we recognize today, and it was happening faster and faster as these changes reinforced each other. More people meant more social complexity. Groups were no longer just isolated family bands struggling to survive in isolation. They were part of broader regional networks, interacting regularly through trade, seasonal gatherings, and probably intermarriage that strengthened bonds between different communities. These larger social networks created something crucial for cultural evolution. They created redundancy and resilience. An innovation that arose in one group could now spread to many others before the original group died out. Knowledge was being distributed across multiple communities, so even if one group faced disaster, the knowledge they carried would survive in other groups who had learned from them. This distributed knowledge storage system was incredibly powerful, essentially creating a collective human memory that transcended any individual group or generation. And then, around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, some humans tried again to leave Africa, and this time they succeeded in ways their predecessors never had. A small population, perhaps just a few hundred people, migrated out of Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. Genetic evidence suggests all non-African humans today descend from this single successful migration event. This does not mean it was the only attempt, but it was the one that established permanent populations outside Africa that survived and thrived. What made this attempt different from earlier failed migrations? The people who left Africa around 70,000 years ago carried with them something their predecessors lacked: accumulated cultural knowledge. They had more sophisticated tools, better hunting strategies, more effective ways of processing food and making clothing. They had larger social groups with more complex organization. They had trade networks that could help them maintain connections over long distances. They had symbolic thinking that allowed them to plan complex journeys, coordinate large group movements, and maintain social cohesion across generations in unfamiliar territories. They were, in short, more culturally advanced than any humans who had come before, and that cultural advantage proved decisive. These migrants spread rapidly once they left Africa. By 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier, they had reached Australia, which required crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean even during periods of low sea level. This was not accidental. You cannot reach Australia by wandering along coastlines or following animal herds. You have to deliberately build seaworthy boats, provision them for multi-day journeys, and navigate across water where you cannot see your destination. Your ancestors 65,000 years ago were accomplished mariners with sophisticated watercraft and navigation skills. They could read stars, currents, weather patterns. They could organize expeditions into unknown territories with no guarantee of finding land on the other side. This requires not just intelligence, but cultural knowledge accumulated over generations, passed down through teaching and storytelling. These were people who could imagine distant possibilities and plan complex actions to achieve them. By 50,000 years ago, modern humans had spread across southern Asia and were moving into Europe and northern Asia. And everywhere they went, they brought that accumulated cultural knowledge with them, adapting it to new environments, innovating rapidly to meet new challenges. The pace of change was accelerating dramatically now, faster than anything seen in the previous 250,000 years of human existence. In Europe, modern humans encountered Neanderthals, who had been successfully occupying the continent for over 200,000 years. These were not primitive cave dwellers, but sophisticated hunters perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe. They had their own complex tool traditions, their own successful survival strategies. But when modern humans arrived between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, something unprecedented began to happen. For thousands of years, the two species coexisted in the same territories, sometimes occupying the same caves at different times, hunting the same animals, using some of the same resources. They were not completely separate. Genetic evidence shows they interbred, not just occasionally, but repeatedly over thousands of years. Modern humans with ancestry outside Africa carry between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, representing dozens or even hundreds of Neanderthal genes that proved useful enough to persist. But despite this genetic mixing, despite the initial coexistence, Neanderthals began to decline. Their populations shrank, their territories contracted, and by around 40,000 years ago, they were disappearing from the archaeological record across most of their range. The last known Neanderthal populations hung on in refuges in southern Spain and possibly Gibraltar until around 37,000 years ago. Then they too vanished, leaving modern humans as the only surviving human species in Europe. Why did Neanderthals go extinct while modern humans thrived? This question has generated intense debate among anthropologists for decades. It was not because Neanderthals were less intelligent. Their brains were actually larger on average than ours, and archaeological evidence shows they were capable of sophisticated behavior, including tool manufacture, fire control, and probably some level of symbolic thinking. It was not because they were physically weaker. Neanderthals were incredibly robust and powerful, far stronger than modern humans. The answer probably lies in those cultural factors we have been discussing. Modern humans had larger social networks that allowed innovations to spread more quickly. They had more complex language that allowed more precise communication and teaching. They had better long-distance weapons like spears thrown with atlatls and eventually bows and arrows, allowing them to hunt more safely and efficiently. They had more sophisticated clothing and shelter construction, allowing them to survive colder conditions with less energy expenditure. Any one of these advantages might have been small, but together they added up to a decisive edge. Modern humans could support larger populations in the same territories. They could hunt more successfully with less risk. They could survive harsh winters more reliably. Over thousands of years, these small advantages compounded. Modern human populations grew, while Neanderthal populations shrank. Far to the east, modern humans encountered another archaic human species, the Denisovans, known mainly from genetic evidence, and a handful of fossils from Siberia and Tibet. Like Neanderthals, Denisovans interbred with modern humans, and today, people with ancestry from Papua New Guinea, Australia, and parts of Southeast Asia carry significant Denisovan DNA, up to 5% in some populations. This is even more Denisovan ancestry than most people have Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting extensive interbreeding over many generations. But like Neanderthals, Denisovans eventually disappeared as distinct populations, absorbed into the growing tide of modern humans spreading across Asia. By 45,000 years ago, modern humans had reached deep into northern Asia. By 40,000 years ago, they were in Europe creating the spectacular cave art we still marvel at today. And they were doing something that neither Neanderthals nor Denisovans had ever managed to do. They were innovating constantly, creating new technologies, new art forms, new social structures at a pace that was unprecedented in human evolution. This is the explosion we have been building toward, the moment when human culture truly took off. Between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, the archaeological record transforms. Suddenly, sites are packed with evidence of symbolic thinking and technological innovation. Cave paintings appear across multiple continents, from Europe to Southeast Asia to Australia. The art is not primitive or simple. These are sophisticated works showing deep understanding of animal anatomy, movement, and behavior. At Chauvet Cave in southern France, painted around 37,000 years ago, the walls are covered with over 400 animal figures, including horses, lions, rhinoceros, and mammoths, rendered with stunning three-dimensional perspective and artistic skill that would not be out of place in a modern gallery. The artists used different techniques to create shading and depth. They took advantage of natural bulges in the cave walls to make animals appear three-dimensional. They depicted movement so skillfully that some animals seemed to be running or charging when viewed in flickering torchlight. This is not just recording what they saw. This is artistic expression of the highest order, requiring the same cognitive abilities that let humans create all forms of art throughout history. Figurative sculptures appear during this period across Europe and Asia. The Venus figurines, stylized representations of women with exaggerated features, are found from Spain to Siberia, suggesting either rapid spread of artistic traditions or independent development of similar symbolic systems across vast distances. At Hohlfels Cave in Germany, archaeologists found a carved ivory figurine called the Venus of Hohlfels, dated to around 40,000 years ago. It is one of the oldest known depictions of a human form, carved with incredible detail and skill. Musical instruments become part of the archaeological record. Bone flutes with carefully positioned holes tuned to specific pitches show that your ancestors were making music 40,000 years ago, creating melodies and rhythms, expressing something beyond mere survival. These flutes required sophisticated understanding of acoustics and mathematics, knowing where to position holes to produce desired pitches. Your ancestors were not just making random noises, they were creating music, probably singing, possibly dancing, engaging in artistic expression that served no immediate survival purpose but enriched their lives with beauty and meaning. Personal ornaments explode in diversity and complexity. People were making elaborate jewelry from shells, teeth, ivory, and bone. They were creating beaded necklaces that required hundreds of hours to manufacture. They were crafting pendants and bracelets. They were decorating their clothing with sewn-on ornaments. This is self-expression, identity creation, possibly status signaling within increasingly complex social hierarchies. Burial practices become elaborate and standardized across large regions, suggesting shared belief systems spreading through populations. Bodies are carefully positioned, often facing specific directions. They are buried with grave goods, including tools, weapons, ornaments, and food, implying belief in an afterlife or journey after death. Some burials show evidence of ritual behavior, with red ochre staining suggesting ceremonial application before burial. At Sunghir in Russia, dating to around 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried head-to-head in a grave filled with over 10,000 ivory beads, bone tools, and elaborately carved spears. The time investment in creating those burial goods would have been enormous, thousands of hours of skilled labor, suggesting these were individuals of great importance to their community. This is not just disposing of bodies, this is honoring the dead with massive communal resource investment. The toolkit expands dramatically during this period. Instead of a dozen or so basic tool types that had characterized the Middle Stone Age for over 100,000 years, the Upper Paleolithic toolkit includes hundreds of specialized implements. Blade technology produces long, thin flakes that are then modified into dozens of specific tool types, including end scrapers, side scrapers, barons for engraving, backed blades for composite tools, borers for making holes, and projectile points of various designs for different hunting situations. Bone and antler technology explodes during this period. Earlier humans had occasionally used bone to make simple tools, but Upper Paleolithic people were creating sophisticated bone implements, including needles for sewing clothing, harpoons for fishing, spear points, spear throwers, and eventually fishing hooks. These bone tools required different manufacturing techniques than stone tools, suggesting rapid expansion of technological knowledge across multiple materials. The development of sewn clothing represents another major innovation. Earlier humans almost certainly wore animal hides for warmth, but Upper Paleolithic people were creating fitted tailored clothing sewn with bone needles using sinew thread. This made an enormous difference in cold climates, allowing humans to maintain body heat much more efficiently and survive in environments that would have killed earlier humans. With sewn clothing, modern humans could move into the coldest regions of Ice Age Europe and Asia, territories that even cold-adapted Neanderthals had struggled to occupy permanently. Hunting technology underwent revolutionary changes. The atlatl, or spear thrower, appeared, a simple mechanical device that effectively lengthened the arm and allowed hunters to throw spears with much greater force and accuracy at distances up to 100 meters. This changed hunting dramatically. Instead of having to get close to dangerous prey animals and risk injury or death, hunters could now kill from a safe distance. Eventually, the bow and arrow was invented, probably between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, based on current evidence, though the exact timing is debated. This was even more revolutionary than the atlatl. Arrows could be shot with precision at distances where prey animals would not even know they were being hunted. A skilled archer could take down animals that would have been nearly impossible to hunt with hand-thrown spears. The bow and arrow may be the single most important hunting innovation in human history, allowing humans to harvest protein efficiently enough to support much larger populations. These weapons innovations had cascading effects. Better hunting meant more reliable food supplies. More food meant populations could grow larger. Larger populations meant more people to generate innovations and more social connections to spread those innovations rapidly. It was a feedback loop accelerating cultural evolution faster and faster. Settlement patterns changed during the Upper Paleolithic in ways that reveal growing social complexity. Earlier humans had been largely nomadic, moving frequently to follow game and seasonal resources, leaving behind little evidence of permanent structures. But Upper Paleolithic people began creating more substantial campsites. Some occupied seasonally for generations, some apparently inhabited year-round. At sites across Europe and Asia, archaeologists have found evidence of organized settlements with distinct activity areas for tool-making, food processing, and living spaces. Storage pits appear, dug into the ground to preserve food for later consumption, suggesting people were planning ahead for lean seasons rather than consuming everything immediately. This kind of forward planning and delayed gratification requires sophisticated cognitive abilities and social organization to prevent individuals from raiding communal stores. These larger, more permanent settlements supported bigger populations living together. Instead of bands of 20 or 30 people, some Upper Paleolithic sites show evidence of groups numbering in the hundreds, at least seasonally, when multiple bands gathered at particularly productive locations. These larger gatherings would have been crucial for maintaining social networks, arranging marriages between groups to prevent inbreeding, exchanging information about distant territories and resources, and spreading innovations. Young people could learn from experts in other bands, seeing techniques and technologies their own group had not developed. Stories could spread, creating shared mythologies and cultural identities across vast regions. These seasonal gatherings were probably where much of the cultural transmission that drove the Upper Paleolithic explosion actually happened. They were innovation conferences, trade fairs, marriage markets, and cultural festivals all rolled into one. The expansion of modern humans into new territories accelerated dramatically after 40,000 years ago. By 35,000 years ago, humans had reached deep into Siberia, living in some of the coldest environments on Earth, with winter temperatures dropping to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. This was only possible because of their sophisticated technology, including sewn cold-weather clothing, constructed shelters often using mammoth bones and tusks as structural elements, and complex fire management. These were not brief expeditions into harsh environments, but permanent occupation by people who developed entire survival systems, allowing them to thrive where no human had lived before. The archaeological record from Siberian sites shows the same explosion of artistic expression and technological innovation seen elsewhere, proving that harsh environments did not suppress creativity, but may have actually stimulated it through the constant problem-solving demands of extreme climate survival. By 30,000 years ago, humans had spread across most of Eurasia, from Atlantic Europe to Pacific Asia. They occupied territories from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle, from tropical Southeast Asia to frozen tundra. And everywhere they went, they adapted rapidly to local conditions while maintaining cultural connections across vast distances through trade networks and shared artistic traditions. The Venus figurines, for example, appear at sites spanning from France to Siberia, thousands of miles apart, dated to roughly the same time period between 30,000 and 25,000 years ago. This suggests either rapid spread of an artistic tradition across the entire Upper Paleolithic world or independent development of similar symbolic systems by groups who shared enough cultural background that they created similar art. Either way, it demonstrates cultural connectivity on a continental scale that would have been impossible without sophisticated social networks. Around 25,000 years ago, the last ice age entered its coldest phase, called the last glacial maximum. Massive ice sheets advanced south, covering northern Europe and northern Asia under kilometers of ice. Global temperatures dropped by several degrees. Sea levels fell by over 100 meters as water was locked up in ice sheets, exposing vast areas of continental shelf that are underwater today. The Bering Land Bridge emerged between Asia and Alaska, creating a corridor that would eventually allow humans to reach the Americas. Conditions in Ice Age Europe became brutally harsh. Many territories that had been occupied became uninhabitable. Human populations retreated to refugees in southern Europe, southern France, Spain, Italy, and the Balkans, areas where conditions remained marginally survivable, even during the coldest millennia. But they did not just survive. They continued to innovate, create art, and develop increasingly sophisticated cultures. The cave art from this period is particularly stunning. Lascaux Cave in France, painted around 17,000 years ago during the coldest phase of the Ice Age, contains some of the most beautiful prehistoric art ever discovered. The famous Hall of the Bulls shows massive aurochs, horses, and deer painted with such skill that they seem almost alive. The artists understood perspective, using overlapping figures to create depth. They understood movement, capturing animals in dynamic poses mid-leap or mid-gallop. They understood color and shading, using different mineral pigments to create subtle gradations of tone. These were master artists working at the height of their craft, and they were doing it while living in one of the harshest environments imaginable during the coldest period of the last 100,000 years. Around the same time in Spain, Altamira Cave was being painted with equally sophisticated images, including the famous bison on the ceiling, rendered in such detail and with such understanding of animal anatomy that when the cave was first discovered in the late 1800s, many scholars refused to believe it was ancient, thinking it must be a modern forgery because prehistoric humans supposedly could not create such accomplished art. We now know they absolutely could and did repeatedly across thousands of years and thousands of miles. The art itself was probably not just decoration. Many caves with paintings are located in deep chambers, requiring difficult and sometimes dangerous journeys to reach them. These were not living areas. People were going to great effort and personal risk to paint in these hidden spaces, suggesting the paintings had ritual or religious significance. They may have been part of hunting magic, ceremonies intended to ensure successful hunts. They may have been teaching tools, showing young hunters what animals looked like and how they moved. They may have been part of initiation rituals for young people entering adulthood. Or they may have had meanings we cannot even guess at, serving purposes in Upper Paleolithic belief systems that are completely lost to us now. Whatever their purpose, these paintings demonstrate that your ancestors 20,000 years ago had rich symbolic lives, complex belief systems, and artistic sensibilities that we recognize as fundamentally human. They were not just surviving, they were creating meaning, beauty, and culture in the face of incredible environmental challenges. While humans in Europe and Asia were surviving the last glacial maximum, others were preparing for the greatest journey of all, the colonization of the Americas. By around 25,000 to 20,000 years ago, humans had reached northeastern Siberia, living in Beringia, the region around what is now the Bering Strait. When sea levels dropped during the glacial maximum, Beringia became a vast plain connecting Asia and Alaska. This was not a narrow bridge, but a subcontinent-sized landmass, hundreds of miles wide, with its own ecosystems, its own animal populations, its own resources. People could have lived there for thousands of years, hunting mammoth, bison, and other Ice Age megafauna, gradually adapting to the unique Beringian environment without even realizing they were positioned to enter a new world. The exact timing of human entry into the Americas remains hotly debated. Traditional models suggested people crossed Beringia and moved south through an ice-free corridor between glaciers around 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, then spread rapidly through North and South America. More recent evidence suggests people may have arrived earlier, possibly by 20,000 years ago or even earlier, traveling along the Pacific coast in boats while the interior remained blocked by ice. What is clear is that once humans entered the Americas, they spread with astonishing speed. By 14,000 years ago, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, over 10,000 miles from the entry point in Alaska. This is one of the fastest large-scale human migrations in prehistory, covering an entire hemisphere in just a few thousand years. And as they spread, these Paleo-Indian populations encountered animals that had never seen humans before. The Americas were home to an incredible array of megafauna that would seem almost fantastical today. Woolly mammoths and mastodons weighing up to 12 tons, ground sloths as big as elephants, saber-toothed cats with 7-inch fangs, dire wolves larger than modern gray wolves, giant short-faced bears standing 12 feet tall, glyptodonts, armored mammals the size of cars, American camels, horses, giant beavers the size of bears, and dozens of other large mammals that no longer exist. Within just a few thousand years after humans arrived, most of these animals went extinct. In North America, roughly 80% of large mammal species weighing over 100 pounds disappeared between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. South America lost even more, perhaps 90% of its large mammals. This megafaunal extinction was one of the most dramatic ecological catastrophes in recent Earth history, and humans were almost certainly involved. Whether we hunted these animals to extinction directly, or whether human presence disrupted ecosystems in ways that caused extinctions, or whether climate change at the end of the Ice Age was the primary driver and human hunting merely accelerated inevitable declines, scientists continue to debate. The truth is probably complex, varying by region and species. But the timing is hard to ignore. These animals had survived previous climate changes and previous warming periods. What was different this time was the presence of human hunters with sophisticated weapons and coordinated hunting strategies. Humans with spears and atlatls could kill the largest animals from safe distances. Humans with fire could drive entire herds over cliffs or into traps. Humans with complex language could coordinate hunts involving dozens of people executing sophisticated plans. And crucially, these American megafauna had not evolved alongside humans. They had no instinctive fear of these upright apes who did not look particularly dangerous. By the time they learned to fear humans, it was too late. Their populations had already crashed below sustainable levels. This pattern repeated itself wherever humans reached new territories with naive prey animals. In Australia, megafauna including giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, and enormous flightless birds disappeared within a few thousand years after human arrival 65,000 years ago. In New Zealand, when Polynesian settlers arrived around 1300 AD, they found massive flightless birds called moa. Within 200 years, all moa species were extinct. Madagascar lost its megafauna, including elephant birds and giant lemurs, within centuries after human arrival. Humans, it turns out, are very effective at driving other species extinct, especially large, slow-reproducing animals that make good prey. This is part of our legacy, the dark side of the same cognitive abilities and technological sophistication that made us so successful. As the Ice Age ended between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, global climates warmed rapidly. Ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose, and environments changed dramatically. The Sahara became green and habitable for a few thousand years before turning back into desert. Forests expanded into areas that had been tundra. Many Ice Age-adapted animals went extinct, not just the megafauna hunted by humans, but many other species unable to adapt quickly enough to changing conditions. For humans, these environmental changes presented both challenges and opportunities. Some territories became less habitable, while others improved dramatically. But by now, humans had the cultural flexibility to adapt to almost anything. When hunting large game became more difficult as megafauna declined, they shifted to smaller animals, increased fishing, and gathered more plant foods. They developed new technologies suited to post-Ice Age environments, including more sophisticated fishing gear, nets and traps, and eventually, in some regions, the first steps toward agriculture. By 12,000 years ago, as the Paleolithic era was ending and the Mesolithic beginning, humans had spread across the entire world except Antarctica. They had developed hundreds of distinct cultures adapted to environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. They spoke hundreds of different languages, though all language families ultimately trace back to common ancestral languages spoken during the Upper Paleolithic expansion. They had art, music, religion, complex social structures, and technological traditions passed down through generations. They were, in every meaningful sense, fully modern humans, behaviorally as well as anatomically. The cognitive revolution that began around 100,000 years ago and exploded between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago had transformed humanity completely. We had gone from being just another hominin species struggling to survive in isolated African populations to being the dominant species on the planet, present on every continent, shaping ecosystems everywhere we went, driving other species to extinction, and creating the complex cultures that would eventually lead to agriculture, cities, writing, and civilization. So what caused this transformation? Why did it happen when it did? After examining all the evidence, most anthropologists today think there was no single cause, but rather a combination of factors that reinforced each other in a positive feedback loop. Population growth was crucial because more people meant more innovations and more connections to spread innovations. Improved technology helped populations grow by making food acquisition more efficient and reliable. Better technology also enabled trade over longer distances, strengthening social networks. These networks allowed innovations to spread rapidly and prevented knowledge loss when local populations declined. Language almost certainly played a role, probably becoming more sophisticated over time, allowing more precise communication, more effective teaching, and better coordination of complex activities. Symbolic thinking emerged gradually, then accelerated rapidly once populations were large enough and connected enough to maintain and elaborate symbolic systems. Each of these factors fed back into the others, creating an accelerating spiral of cultural change that eventually became explosive between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. Once the process began, it became self-sustaining and self-accelerating. Humans had crossed a threshold, reaching a critical mass where cultural evolution could proceed independently of biological evolution, accelerating far faster than genetic changes ever could. This is why the transformation that began 100,000 years ago and exploded 50,000 years ago was so revolutionary. For the first time in Earth's history, a species had developed the ability to evolve culturally faster than it evolved biologically. Your ancestors could adapt to new environments not by waiting millions of years for natural selection to produce appropriate genetic changes, but by inventing new tools, new strategies, new social arrangements within a single generation. They could pass these innovations to their children through teaching rather than through genes. This made humans unimaginably flexible and adaptable compared to every other species that had ever existed. A polar bear is adapted to Arctic conditions through millions of years of evolution that gave it thick fur, layers of fat, and specialized behaviors. But it cannot survive in a desert. A human can live in the Arctic one generation and move to a desert the next, adapting through cultural rather than biological means. This cultural evolution was not just faster than biological evolution, it was accelerating. Each generation could build on the innovations of previous generations, creating an ever-expanding toolkit of knowledge, technology, and social practices. The rate of change was slow by modern standards. We are talking about significant innovations appearing every few hundred years rather than every year or decade. But it was blazingly fast compared to the hundreds of thousands of years during which human culture had remained essentially static. And this acceleration continued to speed up. The late Upper Paleolithic, roughly 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, saw more innovation than the early Upper Paleolithic. The Mesolithic period that followed, roughly 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, saw even more rapid change as people adapted to post-Ice Age environments and began experimenting with new survival strategies, including increased focus on fishing, plant food processing, and eventually the first steps toward agriculture. By 12,000 years ago, humans at the end of the Paleolithic era were culturally unrecognizable compared to their ancestors from 100,000 years ago, despite being biologically identical. They had art, music, religion, complex languages, sophisticated tool technologies, elaborate social structures, and most importantly, the accumulated cultural knowledge of thousands of generations. They had learned to thrive in every environment Earth could throw at them, from Arctic ice to tropical rainforest. They had driven numerous other species to extinction through their hunting prowess. They had outlasted and ultimately replaced every other human species that had once shared the planet with them. They were poised to take the next great leap, the development of agriculture, which would transform human society even more dramatically than the cognitive revolution had. But that is a story for another time. Our focus has been on the mystery of the cognitive revolution itself, the transformation that made everything else possible. So what really happened 50,000 years ago? What was the secret ingredient that turned anatomically modern humans, who had existed for 150,000 years without doing much remarkable, into the creative, innovative, world-changing species we became? The honest answer, after examining all the evidence, is that we still do not know for certain. But we can make some well-informed conclusions based on decades of archaeological, genetic, and anthropological research. First, there probably was not a single moment of change, but rather a cascade of changes occurring over tens of thousands of years, gradually accelerating until they reached a tipping point around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, when everything exploded. The process likely began much earlier, perhaps 100,000 years ago or even earlier, with small incremental changes that were individually insignificant but cumulatively transformative. Second, population size was almost certainly crucial. When human populations were small and scattered, innovations could not spread effectively and were easily lost when groups went extinct. As populations grew and territories became more densely occupied, innovations could spread more rapidly and were buffered against loss because knowledge was distributed across multiple groups. This created a positive feedback loop where larger populations led to more innovations, which led to better survival, which led to larger populations, accelerating the entire process. Third, social networks mattered enormously. The trade networks and social connections that linked distant groups created highways for innovations to travel along. They allowed young people to learn from experts in other bands. They facilitated the spread of artistic traditions, technological innovations, and probably linguistic developments across vast territories. These networks were the infrastructure of Upper Paleolithic culture. Fourth, language almost certainly played a critical role, probably becoming more sophisticated and expressive over time. Complex language allows precise communication of abstract concepts, enables effective teaching of complicated skills, facilitates coordination of group activities, and permits the transmission of knowledge across generations through storytelling. Language is what allows culture to accumulate across time rather than having each generation start from scratch. The development of fully modern language with complex grammar and large vocabularies was probably one of the key changes that enabled the cognitive revolution, though pinpointing exactly when this happened is difficult because language does not fossilize. Fifth, symbolic thinking was clearly central to the transformation. The ability to create and manipulate symbols underlies everything from art to mathematics to religion to complex social organization. Symbols allow humans to represent ideas that do not physically exist, to imagine alternative realities, to plan for distant futures. The appearance of personal ornaments, cave paintings, carved figurines, and elaborate burial practices between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago marks the emergence of fully symbolic cognition. But was this a new capability that arose through genetic mutation, or was it a potential that had always been there, waiting for the right environmental and social conditions to express itself? Most researchers today lean toward the latter interpretation. The cognitive hardware for symbolic thinking was probably present much earlier, perhaps from the very origin of anatomically modern humans, 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. But the software, the cultural practices, and social structures that actually utilized those capabilities took a long time to develop. Sixth, and perhaps most speculatively, there may have been specific genetic changes that contributed to the cognitive revolution. Some researchers point to mutations in genes involved in brain development or neural connectivity that might have fine-tuned cognitive abilities. The FOXP2 gene, which is involved in language ability, shows signs of having been under strong selection in recent human evolution. Other genes affecting brain structure and function show similar patterns. But none of these genetic changes appears to be a magic bullet that suddenly created modern cognition. Instead, they probably represent small refinements that, combined with cultural evolution, gradually enhanced capabilities that were already largely present. The most likely scenario, then, is that the cognitive revolution was not a revolution at all in the sense of a sudden dramatic change, but rather the culmination of a long, gradual process that finally reached critical mass around 50,000 years ago. The biological foundation, the large, complex brain capable of symbolic thought and complex language, was laid down hundreds of thousands of years ago through standard biological evolution. But expressing those capabilities required the right environmental conditions, sufficient population size, adequate social connectivity, and time for cultural knowledge to accumulate. For most of our species' history, those conditions were not met. Populations were too small, climate too unstable, groups too isolated. Innovations occurred but were lost before they could spread and build on each other. This is why we see those frustrating flickers of modernity in the archaeological record before 50,000 years ago, ochre engravings that appear and disappear, shell beads that show up sporadically, technological innovations that do not spread widely. The potential was there, the hardware was installed, but the software could not run stably because the operating conditions were inadequate. Then, gradually, things changed. Populations grew, trade networks developed, social structures became more complex. Innovations started spreading faster than they were lost. Cultural knowledge began accumulating reliably across generations. And at some point, the system crossed a threshold where it became self-sustaining and self-accelerating. Cultural evolution took off. Once that happened, there was no going back. Humans with rich accumulated culture had enormous advantages over humans without it, and absolutely overwhelming advantages over other human species like Neanderthals and Denisovans who had not experienced the same cultural takeoff. Within a few tens of thousands of years, modern humans with Upper Paleolithic culture had spread across the entire world, outlasted the last ice age, replaced all other human species, and driven numerous animal species to extinction. They had become, as we termed it at the beginning, truly unstoppable. But here is what makes this story ultimately uplifting, rather than just a chronicle of extinctions and ecological disruption. Those same cognitive capabilities that made humans such effective hunters and competitors also made us creators. The same brains that planned mammoth hunts painted the caves at Lascaux and Chauvet with breathtaking beauty. The same hands that fashioned deadly weapons carved exquisite figurines from mammoth ivory. The same voices that coordinated dangerous hunts sang songs around campfires, created music on bone flutes, and told stories that bound communities together across generations. Your ancestors were not just survivors or killers. They were artists, musicians, storytellers, and dreamers. They created meaning and beauty in the harshest possible circumstances, during ice ages and megafaunal extinctions and countless other challenges. They passed down knowledge, honored their dead, cared for their injured and elderly, and built the cultural foundations upon which all subsequent human civilization would be constructed. Everything we have today, every technology, every artistic tradition, every scientific discovery, every bit of accumulated knowledge, traces back to those upper Paleolithic humans who first crossed the cognitive threshold and began building human culture as we know it. The smartphone you are looking at, the language you speak, the ability to read these words, the conceptual frameworks you use to understand reality, all of it has roots extending back 50,000 years. The cognitive revolution was not an end point, but a beginning. It set humanity on a trajectory that would eventually lead to agriculture roughly 12,000 years ago, to cities and writing 5,000 years ago, to the scientific revolution 400 years ago, to the industrial revolution 200 years ago, and to the technological explosion of the past century that would have seemed like pure magic to your Paleolithic ancestors. But those ancestors would recognize something fundamental in us because we are them, not just genetically but culturally. We inherited their curiosity, their creativity, their drive to explore and innovate, and push beyond every boundary. The same impulse that drove them to paint caves and cross oceans in primitive boats drives us to write symphonies, build spaceships, cure diseases, and search for life on other planets. We are the children of the cognitive revolution, carrying forward a legacy that began when our ancestors first learned to think symbolically. There is something profoundly moving about realizing that every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from that small population of African humans who survived repeated catastrophes, near extinctions, and unimaginable hardships to eventually populate the entire world. We carry their genes, speak languages descended from theirs, use tools and technologies that are elaborations of innovations they pioneered. We are them, just with 50,000 years of accumulated culture added on top. When you look at prehistoric cave paintings, you are not looking at the work of some alien other. You are looking at art created by people whose brains worked exactly like yours, who felt the same emotions, who loved and feared and hoped and dreamed just as we do. When you hold a carefully crafted stone tool from 40,000 years ago, you are holding something made by hands that were indistinguishable from yours, guided by a mind that was your equal in every way. The mystery of what happened 50,000 years ago is ultimately a mystery about ourselves, about what makes us human, about where the extraordinary capabilities we possess came from. And while we may never know every detail of how the transformation occurred, we can appreciate what it meant. It meant that a species that had been doing essentially nothing remarkable for 150,000 years suddenly became capable of everything remarkable. It meant that humans stopped being constrained by their biology and started being defined by their culture. It meant that we became the storytelling species, the species that creates meaning, the species that looks at the universe and asks why, the species that is never satisfied with things as they are, but always imagines how they could be different and then makes those imaginings real. That is the legacy of the cognitive revolution. That is what your ancestors gave you 50,000 years ago. So the next time you do something creatively human, paint a picture, write a story, solve a complex problem, teach someone a difficult skill, appreciate beauty, ask a deep question, imagine a better future, remember that you are exercising capabilities that arose during that remarkable period when humans truly became human. You are continuing a tradition of innovation, creativity, and cultural evolution that extends back through 2,500 generations to those Upper Paleolithic pioneers who first crossed the threshold into full behavioral modernity. They could not have imagined what their descendants would achieve. They could not have predicted that humans would someday build civilizations of millions, invent writing and mathematics, understand the structure of atoms and galaxies, land on the moon, or create artificial intelligence, but they laid the foundation for all of it by becoming, for the first time, fully and completely human. If you have made it this far through the story, whether you are drifting off to sleep or still fully awake, I hope you have gained some appreciation for the extraordinary journey humanity has taken from those first anatomically modern humans in Africa 200,000 years ago to the global civilization we inhabit today. The story of Homo sapiens is a story of survival against impossible odds, of repeated near extinctions followed by recoveries, of gradual cultural evolution suddenly accelerating into an explosion of creativity and innovation. It is a story that explains why we are the way we are, why humans are simultaneously so similar to other animals in our biology, but so utterly unique in our capabilities. It is a story about transformation, about potential waiting for the right conditions to express itself, about the power of accumulated knowledge and cultural transmission. Most of all, it is a story about what happens when intelligence, social cooperation, communication, and symbolic thinking combine in a single species with sufficient numbers and connectivity to sustain cumulative cultural evolution. The result is a species that can adapt to any environment, solve almost any problem, and continually reinvent itself through cultural rather than biological means. That species is us, and the journey that made us what we are began in earnest 50,000 years ago, when the cognitive revolution transformed humanity forever. Sweet dreams, or if you are still awake, may you carry forward the legacy of innovation and creativity that your ancestors passed down through 2,500 generations to reach you today. Subscribe if you enjoyed this journey through time, and leave a comment telling me what aspect of human evolution fascinates you most. Until next time, keep exploring the mysteries of our past.